Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Odie, and I'm a member of the Colorado Center for Freedom and Justice. And this is our third installment of an interview series that we're doing at CFJ Colorado. We are a Colorado-based nonprofit out of Denver, and our mission is to provide education about and support to the town of Bay Umar in the West Bank. Couple of housekeeping items. Be sure to note our web address in the banner at the bottom of the page, which I'll go ahead and put up there, and our contact information. Feel free to email or write to us to be added to our contact lists. The interview tonight will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. For the Q&A, you may use the chat features on either YouTube or Facebook, though we encourage you to hold off on posting comments or chats or questions until the Q&A session begins. So now I would like to introduce Sergio Atallah, our interviewer for tonight. Sergio grew up in Colombia after his father left Palestine a few years after being dispossessed from his Jerusalem home during the Nakba. Sergio graduated from CU Boulder with an engineering and math degree and worked in engineering for 20 years before becoming a math teacher in 2013. So now I will turn it over to Sergio.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, I think we're honored to have two people that are really veterans in the issue of Israel-Palestine. And it really is an honor to welcome you too. I wanted to start with Jennifer. In fact, I wanted to read a passage that you wrote when you were invited at a press conference in Chicago regarding Israeli settlements. And well, it goes like this. So this is, by the way, you've worked on this for 30 years.
I was going to say, which year was it?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But I guess you'll let me know. I'm like, which one?
Well, this is what you say. And,
okay.
This is not for the thin-skinned, by the way. I've watched as mountaintops in the West Bank have turned into Israeli settlement colonies surrounded by barbed wire and electronic surveillance. Water stolen from Palestinian aquifers fills swimming pools and irrigates green lawns in these settlements. New roads are built to bypass Palestinian neighborhoods and link Israeli settlers to their jobs inside Israel. I've watched as Palestinian communities are attacked by Israeli settler violence. I've seen an entire Palestinian neighborhood's tires slashed and car windows smashed during the night by Israeli settlers. Settlers have burned olive trees and attacked farmers in their fields. Palestinians are attacked by Israeli settlers on their way to worship, work, or school. Settlers have kidnapped children and even killed Palestinians, all with impunity. So that's a pretty damning statement, but it's, you have witnessed this yourself. And my question is, now you're turning your eyes towards Palestinian children. So I'd like to know, I guess the No Way to Treat a Child is one of those venues in which you've spent your time and energy. Tell us about how the No Way to Treat a Child came about.
Well, thank you, Sergio. And yeah, sadly, I think what you read from could have been written in a year. My first visit was in 1982 to Jerusalem and to Palestine and Israel. And, I have seen tremendous changes since then, like I was describing there. But one thing that has been consistent really since the early 80s, and any visitor to Palestine will come away with that, is just how youthful the population is. Everywhere you go, you see children playing in the streets. You see children waving at you if you're in a tour bus. The children in refugee camps will come running out and want to practice their English when they greet you. So children are, the love of every family. They see them lining up every day to go to school. I was a teacher for 3 years in the late 1980s, and got to know a lot of children and their families. And I think the flip side of this kind of amazingly loving community that you see, how children are so cherished by their families, you also see the inability of Palestinians to protect their children, that they are totally unable to protect them from army night raids. You're unable to protect them from seeing the undignified way that a teenage soldier might treat their grandparents or their parents at a checkpoint. You see the inability to get children out of detention. So these things are not new. They're a part of the Israeli occupation and have been for decades. But the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which the American Friends Service Committee and Defense for Children International Palestine that Shaina works with, has started this campaign about 5 years ago, thinking that, actually it's going on 5.5 years, but we started it with the intention of trying to explain to people what it means to be a child living under Israeli military occupation, the experience of children, and how we as a country that provides $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year is complicit in their suffering, is complicit in the attacks on their villages, the kind of experience that we'll talk about tonight of children in prison, in detention, and how this issue of children and the need for their protection is intrinsically linked to the whole Palestinian struggle for freedom and equality and justice. So that's the campaign is, and we'll talk about it more tonight, but it is an effort to tell the story of Palestinian children and to demand accountability and justice, both from our own government and for those who are carrying out the human rights violations against children.
Oh, thank you. Well, in the subject of telling the story, Shaina has certainly had a chance to do that some years back, almost what I would say over 10 years that you've been working on this issue. I understand that you work for Freedom Theater in Jenin, and Jenin is on the northern part of Palestine, of the West Bank. And you researched and also were a contributing writer for a report called Isolated and Alone that documented 108 cases of children who were placed in solitary confinement. So yeah, tell us why solitary confinement for children has taken so much of your energy.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sergio. And thank you to the folks at the Colorado Center for Freedom and Justice for hosting us. I think we felt it was important to document and highlight really what was going on with solitary confinement and for all Palestinian children that are being prosecuted in the Israeli military court system. They're all deprived fundamental due process rights. They're all, or nearly all of them, are experiencing some type of ill treatment and violation of their rights. But I think, for me at least, I read through all 108 testimonies from these children who were placed in solitary confinement, and the amount of psychological trauma that these children are experiencing above and beyond kind of the average detention experience, which is by no means anything. It's horrific. But these children are really experiencing days without any meaningful human contact at all. I think last year in 2020, which is not included in that report, we had one child who was in isolation for 32 days. And so these children, just to give you a sense of what they experience, they're detained, transferred to an interrogation center, and at that interrogation center, they're put in a small cell, confined by themselves. The descriptions of the cell are always the same, regardless of which interrogation center the child is being detained at or which prison. The cell is small, it's filthy, it has a horrible stench. The lighting is harmful to the children's eyes and painful, and along with the paint on the walls. So children are placed in this feeling of just real physical discomfort. The lights are on 24 hours a day. The walls have protrusions coming out so that the child has nothing comfortable to lean back against. And they're kept in these cells for hours and hours each day. And the only time, and their food is given to them through a slot in the door. There's only a ventilation gap at the ceiling, no natural light. So the children are disoriented. They don't know what time of day it is. And the only time that they come into contact with other human beings is when they're being taken from their cells and brought to interrogation. The majority of these children who are placed in solitary confinement are put in stress positions tied to low chairs, again, to make them feel uncomfortable and to make them, these are children as young as 13, we've documented at DCIP, all the way up to 17. And so these children are put in positions that are both psychologically and physically coercive, where they'll do anything to get out of an uncomfortable situation. They'll confess to anything. And what we're seeing is, typically when we think of the use of solitary confinement in the United States, we think of it as really for one of two reasons. One would be to take a vulnerable prisoner out of away from a general population in order to protect them, or to take a dangerous prisoner who might be dangerous to the general population out, and in order to protect the other prisoners. What's happening in this case is that children are not, it's not for their protection, and it's not after they've been convicted of a crime. This is happening while they're being interrogated, before they're being charged. And really the intention, the only thing that we can really discern that they're trying to do is elicit some type of either confession or gather intelligence. Before I wrap up, I just want to talk about the majority of these children also are told after a certain period of days, sometimes weeks, that your interrogation is finished. Now you're going to be transferred to the general population of the prison, and the child will be removed from the disgusting cell that they've been kept in alone for weeks, and they'll be put again alone in a cell, but what I like to think of as solitary confinement deluxe. So it'll be comfortable, there won't be the horrible smell, they'll have clean sheets, and that's when a man, sometimes more than one, comes and befriends the child, tells the child that they're part of the prisoners organization, that they're from a village nearby to where the child is from. They ask the child about their interrogation. They might give them good food and maybe some cigarettes, and really work to earn the trust of these children. And they ask the child, what did you tell them in your in your interrogation sessions? What have you done? Let me know. I can get word on the outside so we can hide evidence or tell people not to make confessions against you. And and sometimes the children have even told us that they've lied and made up things that they didn't do because they've wanted to, seem impressive to these men. They want to seem like real men. And after a few days of earning of these men earning the child's trust, the child will be brought back to their original interrogation room, And that's when they'll be confronted with the statements that they told this man that they befriended, and realize that, no, that man was not their friend. He was an informant or a collaborator. And whenever I read those testimonies where this happened to the child, I couldn't help but think, what does that do to a child long after they've served their sentence and been released from prison? How can they build meaningful connections in their society after undergoing that trauma where somebody took advantage of them in such a vulnerable position? And I think it reminds, I think with solitary confinement, we really do see beyond just the typical trauma that children experience when they're detained, and all of them experience some degree of trauma, the long-lasting effects that it has on Palestinian society as a whole and on these boys' lives for the rest of their lives.
So has this report, what you've been describing, I'm sure it has, Israel has been confronted with it. Has it or has it not? Because I know that there are some bills, there are the House resolutions, they're trying to be passed in Congress, but I'm wondering whether AFSC or Defense for Children International have directly confronted Israel in this regard.
With regards to the solitary confinement report, we have not engaged with the Israeli government on that. We certainly share our reports with other governments and hope that they will use the documentation and evidence that we've provided in those in confronting Israel. But what we've found, at least at DCIP, and we, despite the fact that I'm based in the United States, we have a team of around 40 people, social workers, attorneys, field workers who work on the ground in Palestine. And what we've found really is that making complaints and filing complaints with the Israeli authorities really doesn't effectuate change. That really and I think that this comes out in the report that you spoke about, is that this treatment is not one-off. It's not a bad soldier that's behaving, that stepped out of line and crossed the line. This is all very much intentional. It's not that they're doing something wrong by the Israeli government's standards. It's that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And we've said, and UNICEF has said, and other human rights organizations, that this treatment, the ill treatment of children, is widespread, institutionalized, and systematic. It's not that the system is broken. The system is working exactly the way the Israelis have intended it to. It's no accident that the children are being put in stress positions that don't leave bruises. You know, that's intentional.
Yeah. What? How would you say Israel is different from any other country that perhaps imprisons children? I don't know if you can necessarily place Israel in a different category, or can you?
Well, Israel is the only country that automatically will try children in a military court system. So that is one important talking point when talking about the issue of Palestinian children in detention, is that in the West Bank, which is the territory that we're talking about, there really are two sets of laws. There's one set of law for Israeli settler children, and there's a separate law for Palestinians and Palestinian children. Palestinian children are tried in a military court system. And for those people who might not be so familiar with what a military court is, there isn't the same kind of due process rights that you get in a civilian court. Here I am sharing this information when it's actually Shaina is the lawyer, not me, but at least as much I have learned and witnessed myself is that the soldier's testimony in a military court is what rules. So that the military is the judge, is the prosecutor, and so it's no surprise that it has over a 95% conviction rate, so that anyone that goes into a military court, pretty much is going to be found guilty. For children, the majority of children's crime that they are accused of is of throwing stones, and so that is usually what the charge is, and whether or not a confession is gained or whatever, that is typically why children are detained and can serve, I think, Shaina, isn't it on average 3 months is an average time?
The majority of children serve between 3 months to a year, but somewhere in that space.
So yeah, and what's different too is that that children are held in pretrial detention. So it's like in this country when people are held on cash bail, you can't get out unless you can pay bail. Children or people, all prisoners in a military court system are held before the charges are even brought to them. So the description that Shaina was giving of children that are held in solitary confinement, that whole process is really to break down psychologically and sometimes use with physical force to break the prisoner down so that they will confess. And I think what Shaina said is really important too, of that this system that Israel has set up is a system that's intentional. A lot of people say, why would Israel want to detain children? Like, why do you want to create a whole generation that is traumatized by their experiences, that have only seen, who have very traumatic things happen to them, like Army night raids and being held in detention and being blindfolded and hand-tied and all these horrible things. What good could that do? I think a lot of Americans ask that question. I think members of Congress have asked us that question. And I think how we respond is that you have to remember that Israel is interested in all the land and having all the territory, and for Palestinians to leave. And so if Palestinians feel enough pressure about wanting to protect their children or have a good future for their children or whatever, the hope is that with more and more settlement expansion and making lives so miserable for Palestinians that they will leave. And
I think, sorry, Jennifer, it's not just about making them leave, but it's also about controlling the population that is there. That it's, to some people, it might not sound like that many children are detained each year, somewhere between 500 and 700 children. But that, I think, is really they've realized, like, they only need to arrest 500 to 700 children each year to control entire communities. That it sends a message that, we can do what we want. We can take your children from their beds in the middle of the night, and you can't do anything about it. And so and we know this in some respects because of how gendered the arrests are. It's very, very rare that a girl child will be arrested. Nearly all of the children that we represent and work with are boys, because they know that that arresting girls would be crossing a line. It's not that girls don't necessarily throw stones or don't do the things that boys are accused of doing, but it's that they know that detaining girls would create problems within the communities that they would not be able to control. And so it's much easier and frequently also we see that the boys that they are arresting are boys that could be leaders and in their communities. And so it's about kind of cutting them off from achieving their potential as adults.
So, well, this obviously points to serious violations to the UN Convention on Rights of a Child, the UN Committee on Rights of a Child. It's a number of conventions that have been passed it should be well, essentially, it should not be a backbreaking endeavor to condemn these actions in a criminal court, in international criminal court. Is there anything going on in that matter?
Well, we did just get, so the International Criminal Court, which is has been conducting a preliminary examination for years, and they just in the last month or so announced that there was a question around the jurisdiction of the court, and they just ruled that the court did have jurisdiction. So that will be moving on. In terms of child prisoners, I don't think that will be the top priority. In fact, for DCI Palestine, even though all of this has been well documented, and it's not just us who have documented it, the U.S. State Department includes child detention in its reports every year. They know that it's happening. But for us at DCI Palestine, we're representing families of children who have been killed by Israeli forces. And so that's really been our focus in getting some of those stories on the court's agenda. I think that there will likely be issues around detention, not just with children, but around adults as well. Thinking in terms of the fact that almost all Palestinian prisoners are unlawfully transferred into prisons inside of Israel. That's a violation of Article 76 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So there certainly are grave violations related to prisoners, but I think in terms of what DCI has been focused on, it's more related to child fatalities, but also I think that the ICC will look very closely around the issues of the settlements, and then that will be taking up a lot of when the investigation officially begins, and hopefully prosecution, that the settlements and killings will play a larger role than child detainees.
Okay. Jennifer, why don't you bring us to date in regards to the stateside, what's going on in the United States in regards to advancing human rights of Palestinians, particularly children. I know that there is a House Resolution 2407, and perhaps you could bring us up to date what's going on with that and any other resolutions in the works.
Well, when you're somebody who's been engaged with this issue as long as I have, and probably you as well, we know that there hasn't typically been legislation that we can rally around on this issue. There hasn't been a lot of positive legislation over the years. And typically members of Congress were either too afraid to speak out publicly, or they were blind, or they frankly didn't hear from their constituents about the issue. They just didn't make it a priority. And I think that has changed a lot in the last, 10 years, and specifically in the last few years, when in November of 2017, Representative Betty McCollum, who is from the Midwestern state of Minnesota, introduced the first bill. It was number 4391 for those who care about numbers. But that was the first bill that focused on promoting Palestinian children's rights and calling for certification that the aid money that is given to the state of Israel, and military aid, wouldn't go to subsidize the kind of abuses that Shaina has been describing. And when that bill got some support in the Congress, I think it was 33 members of Congress endorsed that bill, and then when a new Congress comes every 2 years, one has to kind of start over again. So when when the 2018 elections happened, and then the new Congress, HR 2407, which is the bill you referred to, was introduced, and also by Representative McCollum, that continued to create a conversation and a positive vehicle for people all over the country to talk to their members of Congress about Palestinian rights and holding Israel accountable and holding our own government accountable for the aid. And so we're with a new Congress now, and we have a new administration. The last 4 years, it was very difficult to engage at the State Department and administration level, as one might expect. But since January, there's been a whole new set of players, a lot of new progressive members of Congress elected. And we do anticipate in the next month or so a new bill being introduced that centers Palestinian rights and will continue to address this concern about Palestinian children and their rights.
Okay, but my understanding is that the bills, or well, particularly HR 2407, did not necessarily single out Israel, right? I mean, this law was proposed to protect every child under detention. It was not necessarily about Israel, right?
Right. It wasn't singling out in the sense that it was trying to focus on the military court system and saying that no child should be tried in a military court system anywhere in the world. It just so happens that Israel.
Okay, so all right, tell me, why is it that bill could not go forward in the years that it's been introduced? I mean, it seems this is about the right of a child, not to be put in isolation, not to be tried in military courts.
And that's why, I mean, the bill, I think, was crafted in a smart way. First of all, the bill, we should preface this with saying that the messaging around the bill did focus specifically on Palestinian children and Israeli forces' treatment of them. So it was intended to be a bill that constituents could go and meet with their members of Congress and really use it as a means of educating them and starting this conversation. We have no illusions about how much work we need to do with our members of Congress to get them to one, understand what's going on the ground, and two, feel like they have the constituency that will support them if they decide to support this legislation. And so the bill, although the bill was a bill that was generally applicable, in many ways it was very specific in its targeting of Israel and its treatment of Palestinian children, including an authorization for the allocation of $19 million, which would have supported human rights organizations documenting the ill treatment of children, and also organizations working on psychosocial rehabilitation with children who are reintegrating after incarceration. And so
let me ask you, is it fair to single out Israel?
Well, I think Israel singles itself out. Yeah. Because they're the only ones that there are other countries that prosecute children in military tribunals, but not automatically and systematically the way in which we've documented and is well documented for decades. It's not that we're singling out Israel; it's that Israel singles itself out.
And Congress singles Israel out by giving it $3.8 billion a year in military aid, with no accountability, no strings attached. Nobody tracks where that money is going, and that's when people, even including members of Congress, are made aware of that basically a blank check is given. That causes some pause, and I think that all of us who have been advocates for this legislation and doing the kind of grassroots organizing and talking about this issue are seeing progress because people are beginning to ask the kind of basic questions about, like, well, wait a minute, we don't want to. Why should we be supporting these kind of violations? And how can we, if our goal is to have peace and justice for Palestinians and Israelis, and to have a better world and future for everyone, how are we contributing to that? And I think that those are good questions, and we need to keep raising them with our members of Congress.
Right.
And the administration, obviously.
That topic, I understand that you have a petition. Is that something that we're looking at in the chat box?
Yeah,
Well,
so we
go ahead.
So we have there are a couple of petitions that we've been circulating. One has been around children in detention during COVID. And so we're just coming up on a year of DCI Palestine and the No Way campaign calling on Israeli authorities to cease arrests and release all children from detention, because as we know here in the United States and all around the world, there's no social distancing in prisons. Our documentation and reports from children show that children are not provided with the hygienic supplies that they need, or the public health education in order to properly protect themselves from the virus. We've had we've documented 3 children who have been detained and tested positive for COVID while in Israeli detention. It's likely that those children were infected at the time that they were arrested, or or had been exposed prior to their arrest. But in some of those cases, the children were then, after being detained, held with other children, so potentially exposing others to the virus. The most recent of those cases was a 15-year-old who was actually from Beit Omar, who was arrested at the end of December and held for about 2.5 weeks until he was released. And so we recognized the risks that were inherent and in having children being detained. And so we've been using this petition in a number of ways. We've gotten organizations like Save the Children to make strong statements about releasing Palestinian child prisoners. And actually a number of UN officials last May called for the release of Palestinian child detainees. And in part, that was because, I believe, of this petition and the fact that people were raising it as an issue that was important. So people should feel free to sign on to that.
Yeah, please, those who are listening, please do that. In fact, you mentioned the children in Beit Umar. I think the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, made a video that was called Detaining Dreams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was all about Beit Umar children, right? All of them.
That's right. That's right. Well, as your friends in Colorado who follow your work and all the support that you're doing with Beit Omar will know that Beit Omar is a community that's surrounded by Israeli settlements. It has, compared to most villages in the West Bank don't actually have a military tower right in the community like Beit Omar does. So the presence of the Israeli army and military and settlers is very, very evident in Beit Omar, which is a village near Hebron in the southern part of the West Bank. And I think because of the community's closeness to settlers and the friction that happens, those communities are targeted for more Army night raids and arrests of children coming home from school and settler violence and so forth. So when we started this No Way to Treat a Child campaign, we really felt it was important to center the voices of Palestinian children themselves, have them tell what happened to them. And I remember back in 2015, we were trying to figure out how could we get children under 18 a visa to come to the United States. Those seem like way different days than now that we're in COVID, but we were thinking about how to do that because in Europe and the UK, there were a couple of very successful delegations and speaking tours that Defense for Children International Palestine had organized that really caught the attention of members of parliament in the UK and moved a lot of people who were up until that point not very sympathetic about Palestinian rights. So we were thinking about how to do that in the United States. It's a bit of a bigger pond to fly over versus Europe to Palestine to here. And so we decided that we would go there and with the help of some volunteers who have remained with the campaign since the beginning, we're able to collect footage and DCI Palestine's relationship with families, both in the support roles of offering legal services, but also counseling and support after detention, really set a very special really a special moment for these families and children to tell their stories about detention in a way that most of them had never opened up about before. And I think if people would like to see the movie, it's a 20-minute film. It's called Detaining Dreams. I think we can put the link in the chat. But they're the story of 4 young boys in the Beit Omar and neighboring refugee camp who talk about all these stages of detention that were really important in us focusing. How do we tell the story of detention? And we really were able to, through them, to talk about that whole experience of being arrested and being held, not having access to lawyers, being afraid of what would happen, of the violence that they experienced, the kind of coercion that Shaina referred to of somebody pretending to be a supporter and was actually an informant. So all these boys talked about that, being bitten by a dog and not getting medical care, really very challenging, difficult stories. And so that was what was captured in this video. And we showed that and other footage that Christian Peacemakers teams and B'Tselem and some of the other groups on the ground who've taken footage of the experience of settlers arresting and blindfolding and detaining children, and showed that to some members of Congress, including Representative McCollum, who were frankly horrified. And also, surprisingly, despite the fact that this has been something that has been going on for decades, many members of Congress said, I never knew that happened. I didn't know about these night raids and about military detention and what happens there. And so it was a real opening for us. Yeah. And those children in Beit Omar continue to be arrested, night raids. It's
that's
ongoing.
The reason why we're in business.
Yes.
We looked at Beit Omar as not an atypical case in the West Bank in Area C, that the story needs to be told.
And can I just say too, though, that also an incredibly strong community and the wonderful grapes that they grow and the grape leaves and and families and I mean, I think to be in solidarity with communities there, one needs to yes, be aware of the human rights violations and the suffering, but also the way that people are resilient and remain steadfast and still rebuild their homes and still replant the trees and still pass on the stories of their dispersal and connection to the land. So thanks. I just wanted to say that.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, and in fact, I want to thank you both. Your work is truly outstanding. And Shaina, I wanted to also mention that I don't know if you mind being divulging your identity as Jewish, but I'm particularly touched by Jews that work on this issue. You have a law degree, you could go anywhere in the world, and yet you choose to work on this Palestinian issue. And my heart goes for people like you, and in fact for the founder of our organization, who's also Jewish. Tell me, do you see how the Jewish community could advance this more than any other, or is this something that everybody should just be aware of, regardless of their connection to Israel?
Yeah, well, I think that everyone has an important role to play in fighting for justice. I think one of the challenges that I struggle with on a personal level as a Jew is that on the one hand, I recognize the power of my identity, the privilege that I have as a Jewish person, and that, for example, very recently, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem issued a report declaring that basically saying that there's apartheid between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Palestinian organizations have been saying this for years, but it's somehow people attribute, the fact that a Jewish Israeli organization has said this means that it's legitimate. And so I think as Jews, we have the responsibility to listen to Palestinians, understand what they're experiencing, and amplify their experiences and their voices, as opposed to drowning them out. And so I think that there's a tension there between recognizing the power that we have and using that for good, but also working to relinquish some of that power. The fact that I've been to Palestine and seen the injustice shouldn't make me as a Jew my opinion more valid than your opinion, Sergio, as the child of a Palestinian man, and I think that that's where there is a tension. But I do see that Jews have an important role to play. I think that since I started working on this issue more than 10 years ago, I've seen a growth of particularly younger Jews who have realized that the stories that we were told in Hebrew schools and at Jewish summer camps and at Jewish day schools, was not the full truth, was not truthful in some cases at all, and that there is a feeling of responsibility to fight for justice and make things right. I think particularly those of us who were raised being told what an important role Jewish people played in the civil rights movement here in the United States, that to see a hypocrisy, or as we call them, the PEPs, the progressives except for Palestine, that I think more and more Jews are realizing that we can't be PEPs, that we have to be including Palestine in our activism, and that there can't be a double standard.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah.
And your stands. Well, with that, I think we need to take it back to Jennifer, so that perhaps we give some chance to other people to ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Sergio, and thank you so much, Jennifer and Shaina, for all of your knowledge and the discussion tonight. So our first question has come in from Alex on YouTube, and the question is, how did Shaina learn that what she was taught at summer camps, etc., was not true?
Okay. Well, first of all, I should be full disclosure here. I did not go to Jewish summer camp. But I did have a very typical American Jewish experience in the sense that I was forced to go to Hebrew school 6 hours a week growing up. And I have to be honest that I grew up with parents who were not very typical. They didn't really accept narratives that were fed to them, and so I have strong memories of coming home from Hebrew school and saying things like, they told us the Arabs all want to kill us, because they weren't even Palestinians, they were just Arabs. And my dad said something to me like, well, you'd be pretty pissed off if your land was stolen too. And I think we didn't know anything about the Nakba at that time, or really the facts around the establishment of Israel in 1948. But I was lucky enough to know that there was something, to be educated through my family, even if we were ignorant. We knew that what we were being told was not the full truth. And I also I had a close friend growing up whose stepfather was Palestinian, and his family's land is actually now part of Ben Gurion Airport in Lod. And so with him, I also was exposed to his experiences growing up in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, and understanding that the narrative that I was being fed was not true. Unlike the young people that I spoke about earlier, did not go through the trauma of realizing that everything that I'd been taught as a child was a lie. So I was lucky in that way.
Okay, thank you. If others have questions on Facebook or YouTube, feel free to chat them in and we will read them off to our presenters. Okay, another has come in and it says, how do we approach Americans about the subject, whether it be no way to treat a child or Israel-Palestine? What have you found to be the best practices in approaching others and how to speak about it? And that's also from Alex on YouTube. Great question.
Do you want me to take that first? Sure. Well, I'm sure Shaina and I both have ideas about that. But I try to always find ways of relating the experience to things that are happening in the present. So whatever, if people are talking about vaccinations and COVID, today it's horrifying to know that 500,000 Americans have died of COVID here in the United States. It's a shocking statistic, and it weighs heavily on all of us, especially if we've had family members who and friends who have died or suffered. And yet the experience of COVID has also given us an opportunity to think about others who live in confined spaces, don't have access to healthcare, people in prisons where COVID has had a horrible impact on people incarcerated. And so I always try to talk about my experience in Palestine, or what I'm reading or hearing from people there about and related to whatever is in the news of the day. So this, whether it's COVID and the fact that Palestinians have not gotten the vaccine or were delayed in getting the vaccine, who don't have a healthcare system that is even contiguous because of the divided nature of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, and then Gaza on its own blockaded and completely cut off. How do you have a healthcare system even that can attend to all those communities when there's walls and checkpoints and everything? So I think helping people to relate their own experience and then see see the rights violations against Palestinians and to try to imagine the experience is something I think is always useful. And again, like talking about children and the love that the communities have for their children and the way that they care for them and want to protect them. That's something that we all share. Those are universal values. I always think that this campaign is one that is so wonderful because it reaches the head, heart, and hand, as I used to say. It's full of documentation and statistics, and you can, it's well documented what happens to children and the experiences even of Israeli soldiers through Breaking the Silence have talked about the experience. So it's well documented issue. It's a hard issue because we all love our children and we love our communities. We hope for the future. We want to build a better world for the future. So it's part of the heart. And then the hand part is having things to do, being able to talk to our members of Congress, being able to talk to our neighbors, to pass resolutions. Here in Colorado, just last year, the Democratic Party platform included support for 2407. So people everywhere are taking this campaign and this issue and finding really creative ways of talking to more and more Americans. And I think that that's making a difference.
Great. So important to share other stories. That's really what touches people. So another question. So the introduction of the resolutions like HR 2407, do you think it's broadened the base of people who are interested in the issue and maybe made them more sympathetic to the Palestinian situation just by it getting more attention in Congress and so forth? That's for either one of you.
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, I think that as Jennifer just so eloquently spoke about, children are so important to communities and to people, and these stories have an impact. And so I think 2407 has so often in our movement, we're seen as protesting. We're seen as going and protesting against something, protesting blockades of Gaza or killings of individuals. And this bill gives us the opportunity to be proactive as opposed to reactive. We have something that we can approach our members of Congress about, and we also have something that we can talk to our neighbors about and use that to build coalitions. And I think that for sure we've been able to broaden the people that we're reaching through our work. We've been able to, unfortunately, draw parallels between incarceration with communities of color in the United States and the experiences of Palestinian children in the military detention system. So we're drawing those, bringing in communities that wouldn't necessarily be making those connections, and we're really able to expand how we're talking about these issues and to have something specific. I think the beauty of the legislation that we've had introduced is that we have these vehicles to open those conversations. Obviously the goal of these is to get the legislation passed, and the long-term goals to get the legislation passed and to protect Palestinian children. But in terms of short-term goals, it's to be able to give activists the tools and the vehicle to be able to approach their elected officials in their community to advance the issues.
So let me ask you, well, Jennifer, I think, I mean, you've done speaking tours, conferences, campaigns of education, advocacy, a number of things. So I wonder, how do you prevent an issue like this becoming an issue of anti-Semitism? Is there like a strategy that can be placed to demonstrate that this is nothing, there's nothing anti-Semitic about this, that it does place Israel in a position where he has to be accountable, that he's being held accountable? I wonder if you have any thoughts on this issue.
Well, yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I would say that, we've certainly seen an increase in anti-Semitism in our country here, and whether it's people at the Capitol with anti-Semitic shirts on, or attacks on Jewish synagogues and so forth. So anti-Semitism is real, and anti-Jewish bigotry is real, and we need to challenge that. And but it is different. That is different than criticism of Israel, and to call people anti-Semitic or when they are questioning the actions of a government is illegitimate, in my opinion. That we should be able to criticize. We criticize our own government. We criticize leaders and policies. That's how we bring about social change. So does anti-Semitism exist? Yes, but it is different than criticism of Israel, and making that distinction is obviously super important. And those who try to weaponize anti-Semitism and to call people anti-Semitic as a way of silencing also has to be challenged.
Yeah, and along those lines, I don't know if you're familiar that Facebook, some insider in Facebook revealed that the term Zionist and Zionism was going to be, I guess, protected, is the way that they described it, in the same way that Jewish and Israeli is now being, I guess, scrutinized for anti-Semitic, potential anti-Semitism. I know that the term Zionist has, it tends to have many meanings. How would you use the term Zionist?
Oh, are you asking me or Shaina or both of us?
Well, Shaina, yeah, because
Zionism is an ideology, right? Zionism is an ideology that it is what founded the Israeli state, and I think that people are who are critical of Zionism, again, and that's different than being anti-Jewish or against a religion. Zionism is an ideology. Judaism is a faith. So I think that that's an important distinction. And in terms of the Facebook campaign that you were describing and other efforts underway, there are some excellent campaigns being led by Jewish Voice for Peace and other organizations that are taking on that issue and have excellent resources, as well as our friends in the North in Canada. There's where the issue is very contested, are also doing some excellent work and have some great resources for people who want to follow up on that issue.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to note just that the majority of Zionists are not Jewish. They're Christian Zionists. There's a much larger proportion than Jews, and not all Jews are Zionists. And so it's important to recognize that while the words are sometimes used interchangeably, they are by no means should be.
Well, even Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein would describe themselves as Zionists. So sometimes I see it used in ways that Zionism now, what it means now is the right to essentially take over the West Bank, to annex the land in the West Bank. I mean, that's frankly my personal definition of Zionism, and that's the way I've seen it used by peace organizations or organizations that support Palestinian rights. And of course, that's it's a different definition than those who tend to be Jewish, in fact.
Okay, so that about wraps it up for us. It's a little bit after the hour. So again, Jennifer and Shaina, we wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This means a lot. Your work is incredible. We'll continue to follow all that you do. For everyone, if you haven't noticed, we've been posting a ton of information in the chat, so you might want to go ahead and copy and paste that real fast if you haven't seen it already. Just a wealth of websites and information. And the DCI Palestine website is in there. The No Way to Treat a Child link is in there. And then again, Colorado Center for Freedom and Justice, our website is in the banner, the www.cfjcolorado.org. So we encourage you to visit our site as well. Sergio, I want to make sure you didn't have any final words before we end tonight.
No, just my appreciation to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So this will be posted on Facebook automatically, and we'll post it to save on YouTube as well, so everyone can share with their friends. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we're planning on having monthly webinars, so stay tuned and contact us if you want to be on our list. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.